Hi, and welcome back to part 4 of our podcast miniseries on the 1980 Gwangju uprising. If you haven't listened to parts 1 to 3 yet, I'd go back and listen to those first. Hi, and thanks for listening to the Working Class History podcast. As we bring this mini-series to a close, we just wanted to give a final reminder that this has only been made possible because of support from you, our listeners, on Patreon. So if you'd like to support us and access exclusive content, like a bonus episode with more information and stories from the Gwangju uprising from our interviewees, sign up to join us on Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. As a content note, there's a brief mention of sexual violence later on in this episode. After the uprising was crushed, the working class and pro-democracy movements all over the country were met with a wave of repression. Kap Su Seol, researcher and co-translator of the book Gwangju Diary, explains more.
I think we should talk about legacy of Gwangju and the aftermath of Gwangju. We should talk about South Korea entirely. After the Gwangju, everywhere become a Gwangju in a sense. There's always mass arrest. Police siege bookstore. Police was everywhere. Police was on college campus. I mean, in U.S., such and frisk was big issue for many years, but such a frisk was daily life in South Korea for a while. If you are 20, walk down to downtown Seoul, you have to be stopped by police at least twice. And that they search your bag, your pocket, pretty much everything. And it was a very dangerous time for young men to live in South Korea in 1980s. But as Hangang say, because I couldn't hold a funeral for you, my entire life funeral, that sums up what we feel about the Chun Doo Hwan and the others. Many students say, when I have a drink and got drunk, we cannot live on the same sky with Chun Doo Hwan. So either Chun Doo Hwan go or we go. That's the general mood of a student back then. The same is true of many workers.
Han Kang is a Korean author who wrote an amazing book about the Gwangju uprising called Human Acts. It is extremely harrowing in parts, but we definitely recommend it to everyone to read at some point. The repression continued through the 1980s. And while Kim Yong Ho managed to avoid arrest in the aftermath of the rebellion, he was picked up some years later.
그 이야기를 조금 제가 더 드리면 제가요 84년도에 군대를 가게 됐습니다.
If I were to tell you a little bit more about that, I joined the army in 1984. And when I joined, without any particular reason, the battalion commander told me to run an errand riding this jeep car in the barracks. And so I got on the jeep. There I saw a senior of the company next to mine was wearing an eye patch. So I was taken by the jeep car, and later it turned out that I was taken to the place called 505 Security Unit without any reasons. I was not even an activist. I was just a kid who was swept away in the situation of May 18th. You know what? They didn't even ask me any questions for a week. They just tortured and assaulted me. I think it lasted about a week. I was tortured in every possible way except the electrical torture. I was beaten all over my body with sticks, even got beaten my nails off my hands and feet with sticks. And then there was a water torture where they cover my face with a towel and pour water over it. Yes, I got tortured in every way. Later, they demanded me to state that I was educated by North Korea, fired guns at our soldiers, and started a riot. No, see, I was only a high school student. I was a kid who had no idea what was going on then. And now I'm being told to make a statement that I was educated by North Korea and participated in the uprising. Surely I can't, so I refuse to state that. But the violence and torture never stopped. So I was finally convinced to state everything as they required. I became a spy educated by the North Korean military. But how do I know what it takes to be a spy? What do I know to make a statement? They stacked up North Korean books in front of the desk and demanded me to say I read them. But how can I describe what's in the books when I have no idea what the contents are? So the soldiers drew a line from the prologue part, and I was to take a dictation of those lines. Well, that seemed to be the only way to survive. I only hoped that they stopped torturing and assaulting me. When I wrote them all down, fortunately on the 15th day of my capture, the local community found out that I was caught there and investigated. The community went on a sit-in in front of the Unit 505, and I was finally cleared of those charges after 15 days.
David Dolinger, a young Peace Corps volunteer stationed outside of Gwangju, was largely shielded from legal repercussions, but he was kicked out of the Peace Corps.
On the 28th, a van was sent by the Peace Corps that came down to Gwangju, picked all the Peace Corps volunteers up, and drove us back to Seoul. And we were taken to the Peace Corps offices in Seoul, which were right next to Gwanghwamun. And we met the director, and the director put us in one room all together and said, I wanted to start to talk to all of you individually. And I was the first one he decided he was going to talk to. He asked me flat out when we went into his office, did you spend the night in the provincial office buildings? And I said, yes, because I wasn't going to lie to him. And he said, because of that, we deem that you have been politically active and you are no longer a Peace Corps volunteer. You can either write the letter of resignation or I will write the letter of resignation. You can either sign it or I will sign it, but you're no longer a Peace Corps volunteer. So I actually told him to write the letter of resignation because I would not write it. So with that, I was thrown out of the Peace Corps. With the also stern warning that the U.S. Embassy and the Peace Corps could no longer protect me, and that from what they knew, the Korean government was quite upset with what I had been doing, and there was a potential that I might come to harm. And their advice for me was to leave the country immediately, which I didn't listen to. Of course, hey, you start with Gwangju, why not keep going?
The Gwangju uprising had lit a fire in South Korean society. The government tried to snuff it out with brute repression, but it failed to extinguish it completely, as Kim Yong Ho explains.
75년, 6년 계속 학생들 시위를 했고.
All the way up to the uprising for democracy on 5/18 or May 18th. There was continuous activism among students. As the resistance from the general population continued, it exploded.
Despite being blacklisted, David actually managed to get a visa to remain in South Korea. We speak more with him about this in the bonus episode for our Patreon supporters. So he was able to get into contact with other pro-democracy activists.
Luckily, after that, as I said, some of the Presbyterian, as some people refer to them as the radical Presbyterian missionaries, contacted me because they knew that I had stayed in Gwangju, and they were actually quite worried about my mental health and the mental health of the other Peace Corps volunteers. So they had actually contacted the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Peace Corps, and one of the missionaries was a trained psychiatrist who said, I'm more than willing to see them as much as they need to help them get through this. Both the U.S. Peace Corps and the U.S. Embassy refused to tell her how to contact any of us and to talk to us, that they did not need her help. I was actually able to meet her. That was Sue Rice. She was actually quite active with the Korean dissidents. And so I actually became very involved with the Korean dissidents smuggling in information. I actually took a job on a military post teaching remedial math and English to U.S. military personnel, and used my APO privileges to get information in and out of Korea without it going through the censors. I also was lucky enough to go to Galilee Church. So if you do a little history on that, that was a meeting of really the mothers and wives of the dissidents. And I was one of the few males that ever went to Galilee Church. And there I was actually able to meet the mothers, the wives of a lot of the key dissidents in Korea at that time. And they were very, meaningful meetings that they had. It was amazing the kind of power you could feel from these women. It truly made me believe that the real strength in Korea, especially as they went towards democracy, were actually going to be these women, because they really held everything together, right? They held their families together. They kept communications going within the dissidents groups. They took, made sure their husbands were all right when they were locked up in prison. They were just a true power that I think were underappreciated by the Korean citizens, but luckily not appreciated at all by the dictatorial government of Korea. So they were overlooked.
Eventually, in mid-1986 and early 1987 in Seoul, there were a couple of events surrounding two individual sparks which reignited the fire, which would soon destroy the dictatorship. First, a young woman labour organiser called Kwon In-suk sued the government after being sexually assaulted during an arrest by police. This was a landmark event which shocked everyone. Partly because of the stigma associated with sexual assault, survivors were expected to stay quiet, and partly because Kwon actually forced the police to admit what they did, although they themselves claimed it didn't legally constitute sexual assault technically, which of course it did in reality. Then, in January 1987, a young student activist called Park Jong-chul died in police custody, and it soon emerged that he'd been tortured to death by police. Protests for workers and democratic rights escalated hugely through 1986 and 1987, and on the 9th of June 1987, another 21-year-old student, Lee Han-yeol, was hit in the head by a tear gas canister fired by police, and later died. Then, huge protests erupted everywhere, which the government couldn't repress or contain, and Chun Doo Hwan's regime was forced to agree to reintroduce democracy at the end of the month.
There was a big push for democracy in 1987, in June 1987. And after that protest, South Korea finally could elect president in a free election. After that, CIA put out a very interesting document called Gwangju Generation. And they call student activists and the opposition leader who eventually defeat Chun Doo Hwan, Gwangju Generation. And when I read the document like 4 years ago, no, this is it. Even we push hard things enough for US to admit that we are here, we are exist here to beat back Chun Doo Hwan, eventually beat the US influence back then. Yeah. So I'm proud of a part of Gwangju Generation, and many of my contemporary would be proud of part of Gwangju Generation too.
Kap Su Seol took part in these protests as well.
I was arrested and detained in police station for 3 days. Yeah, actually, what's interesting about this political change can take place very fast without letting know what actually happened. Even 2 days before the June 8th, I was not sure actually that many students will join the protest 2 days later, because we have a hard time, the student activists, students to vote to shut down the school. Not many students were unhappy that they have to close the school for protest. But on June 10, my school there were 8,000 students. The 5,000 came out to protest. Gwangju generation. That's why CIA called Gwangju generation. It was total surprise. And the 7 years can be a long period, but 7 years very short. It's just 7 years apart, 1980 and 97. I mean, I'm early 50 now. Obviously, I cannot deceive about my age anymore. After this, but 7 years is nothing. People still have a vivid memory of it. But at the same time, it's an incredible story to rise up again after that brutal repression. That's another incredible story.
Right after the June protests, when the government had agreed to reintroduce democracy but elections hadn't been held yet, in August, an unprecedented wave of wildcat strikes began through industry, involving over 1 million workers at its peak, which won significant improvements in pay and conditions. But 1987 in South Korea is really another story, and one we plan to tell in a future podcast episode. Later on down the line, in the 1990s, Chun Doo Hwan was eventually criminally charged for his role both in the military coup in 1979 and for the repression of the Gwangju uprising in 1980, in addition to other offences like bribery. He was sentenced to death in 1996, but the following year he was pardoned by the then president, former pro-democracy activist Kim Yong Ho. The pardon was also agreed to by the incoming president who'd just been elected, the other former democracy activist Kim Dae-jung, whom Chun had actually tried to have killed. This was a move for reconciliation, but it did upset a lot of the victims of the regime and their families. In assessing the Gwangju uprising, it's a good example of one of those struggles which, if you look at it in isolation, it looks like a failure. None of the demands put forward by the rebels and agreed at the assemblies around the fountain outside the provincial office got implemented at the time, and lots of people were killed and imprisoned. But when you consider what came after it, it really wasn't a failure after all.
I think what Yoon Sang-won said at the last meeting with Malaysia sums up. He said, "We die today to live forever." That sums up. I mean, obviously the uprising ended in tragedy and ended in another bloodbath, but they live forever. There are many definitions you can have about the uprising, especially bad one. But Gwangju was very special because it completely changed the way people look at your government, people look at your international ally, US, especially for me, how people look at working class, ordinary folks. So Gwangju was not, in that sense, was not ending in defeat, but it was like a moral compass. When you have difficulties politically, when you face some issue in political, you have to look at Gwangju, what they do in a situation like this, what Yoon Sang-won would do in a situation like this. So Gwangju was physically and militarily, it was a defeat. But politically, traditionally, it was not defeat at all.
Yoon Sang-won, remember, was one of the leaders of the hardline faction of the rebels, killed during their last stand on the 27th of May. For Kim Yong Ho, at the time of the uprising, he didn't even think about whether or not it could be successful. As far as he was concerned, he was just fighting for his life, as well as that of his neighbours, friends and family.
I've never thought of it as an uprising. Yes. I don't think I had time to think about how to win, and I don't know, now that I see, I was only thinking about that I needed to survive, and I needed to fight against in order to live. I couldn't really think of anything more than that.
We started work on these episodes in early 2020, in the run-up to the 40th anniversary of the uprising. Despite the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, South Korea initially kept the outbreak under control by taking sensible outbreak control measures, unlike many of our governments. So the planned 40th anniversary commemoration events of the uprising were able to take place in May 2020. Our friend Michael Choi went there and kindly undertook interviews with us, with Kim Yong Ho and Chun Yong Ho.
It's been 40 years, And when I talk to teenagers now, I have to start my stories by saying, once upon a time when tigers used to smoke.
Once upon a time when tigers used to smoke is a Korean idiom used at the beginning of a lot of folk tales. It essentially denotes a time in the past, but also in a world which is very different from today.
어느덧 40년 지났는데 여전히 그 40년이
I often say, I'm going to tell you a story once upon a time when tigers were smoking a cigarette, and it's been 40 years, but I think May of 1980 is still ongoing. And one of the biggest reasons is that slaughter, those people who fought against the possibility of my family being killed, now they distort it as a riot brought down by trained North Korean soldiers. They still act like it's the truth. And it's been 40 years now, but I still see so many people who believe that mistruth as the truth. The day before yesterday, a group of right-wingers came to Gwangju to insult the city by holding a rally in Geunramro in a historical cemetery to say that it was a riot caused by the North Korean army and that the people of Gwangju were involved in the riot.
The events around the Gwangju uprising are now pretty well known in South Korea. Especially in recent years, there have been a bunch of films and TV shows made about the events, some of which we're going to mention at the end of this episode. And there's even a reference to it in the song by K-pop group BTS in their song My City. J-Hope, who's from Gwangju, mentions the numbers 062518, 062 being the Gwangju area code, and 518 referring to the May 18 uprising. But the history of these events is still hotly contested. Right now, there's a centre-left government led by former pro-democracy activists, which does acknowledge the facts. But the hardline conservative right still try to paint the uprising in Gwangju as being something stirred up by the North Korean government, something which is clearly and completely fabricated. The current government is even discussing criminalising the falsification of history about events like the Gwangju uprising.
여전히 자신들의 집권을
The reason why I mentioned this story is because still, to keep their positions, some needed logic for this crime. The crime that occurred by using the military to justify their criminal act, they needed to turn this into a North Korean military riot. And to make this story true, they threatened, assaulted, and tortured normal students like me. I heard a lot of people have been treated in the same way.
A lot of the responsibility for lack of knowledge about the uprising lies with the South Korean media.
South Korean media, I think it's kind of exaggerate to say they have to keep silence about what happened in Gwangju. But some media, big media such as 조선일보, 중앙일보, 동아일보, and the Korean broadcast team was active player in crossover fact about Gwangju throughout the 1980s. Maybe because they feel they have to. That doesn't matter at this point. But they are active collaborator with military rule in South Korea. That's the dark side of Korean journalism. And actually, many media, many young journalists could not speak out about what happened in Gwangju, even though they know what happened in Gwangju. After the end of uprising, 무등일보, that's one of the major newspaper in Gwangju, had a banner headline say, Mountain Mudung would know. They cannot run any article about it, but they say Mountain Mudung, that's the highest mountain that's surrounding Gwangju, would know. That's banner headline. No article, just the banner headline say Mountain would know. There's some sort of general condition mass media or press faced with back then.
희생됐고 이용된 사례를 들었거든요. 그래서 제가 그 이야기를 왜 하냐면
So here's the reason why I'm telling you this story. It's been 40 years now, but I strongly feel that there are still too many people who false believe in the logic of the regime. And I'd like to tell them, May 18th was not North Korean military related, but it was rather a process that normal people fought for their survival against the ruthless violence and slaughter that took place by our own soldiers. Now, I grew up and see this was actually democratic resistance. And as a result, it was right, of course. But for me, that scene was a resistance to violence and slaughter. I want to tell you that it was a story of the people who survived by struggling together and by forming a community.
David Dolinger goes back to South Korea regularly and has attended lots of Gwangju uprising commemorations.
Oh, I try to get back as often as possible. I've been to the 518 anniversary ceremonies multiple times. I was lucky enough to see them force President Park to leave. One of the proudest days, seeing them sing, and force her to just leave, because she was not supposed to leave when she did. Her security team hustled her out as the mothers walked up the aisle singing.
If you don't follow South Korean politics, you might be a bit taken aback hearing the name President Park again in a different century. David here is talking about President Park Geun-hye. She's the daughter of the dictator Park Chung-hee, and she's a right-winger who was elected in 2013.
So at that point in time, the Song of the Beloved? They weren't allowed to sing it. And the mothers, of course, were not going to stand for that. So they actually had gotten together at the back of sort of where all the seating was. And at the appropriate time, they got up and started singing it and walking down the aisle towards where President Park was sitting. With that, a lot of us stood up and started to sing. And as soon as her security team saw that pretty much the entire audience were people from Cholanamdo, and that we were not going to obey the law to not sing the song, they immediately grabbed her and hustled her out.
March for the Beloved, the theme tune used for this miniseries, was once used in a North Korean film made about Gwangju, so the song was banned in South Korea, who claimed it was communist, even though the song was written well before the film was made.
민주화를 상징하는 투쟁의 노래로
There's a song called March for the Beloved that symbolizes democracy. The background of the song is that it is the sole wedding song of martyr Yoon Sang-won and Park Ki-sun, two of the 7 martyrs of Wildfire Night School.
Anyway, President Park Jr. ended up being brought down by a corruption scandal. She'd befriended a woman, the daughter of a medium, who claimed to be in contact with Park's dead parents. Park used her power to force corporations to give her friend tens of millions of dollars. This got out, and after a mass protest movement, she was impeached, removed from office, then tried and imprisoned. In the new elections, Park's conservative Saenuri party was comfortably beaten by the centre-left Democratic United Party. Going back to the Gwangju uprising itself, the events had a completely transformative effect on David's outlook and his life in general.
As I put it to people, Gwangju was the day I was born. Right, that's my birth city for joining the human race. Before that, I don't really believe that I was actually in some ways part of it. Yes, I was a person, I'm a human, but I was not really part of the human race. And yeah, I did wanted to help people, but I had no idea really who I was, what I was doing. But it really opened my eyes to sort of the politics and the imperialistic attitudes of the United States. And that, here I was somebody that voted for Carter because, hey, you put human rights at the top of the list. Fantastic. I believe in that. And then to see that it really meant nothing in South Korea at that point in time. Even when you had people asking for the help, it was ignored. And, to top that off, I hate to say it, in some ways, I was even greatly disappointed by the journalists. Most of the journalists that were there, they just looked at it as a story. And, yeah. And in fact, some of them sat there and told us, these kids in the provincial office building have no idea what they're doing. This is going to, come to a really bad end. And I'm sitting there going, but if you're a human being, yeah, maybe you want to report on it, but don't you think you should be part of the bigger picture? Right? We're all the same. They're not Koreans. We're human beings. I couldn't take how they could be so detached. And really, what didn't affect them to see some of the bodies that, I was looking at going, how could someone even do that to someone? What kind of person could do that?
Another important aspect of the coverage of this uprising is about class. As with a lot of social movements, like the Tiananmen Square protests we discussed last time, as well as the May 68 protests in France and countless others, many mainstream narratives talk about student movements, but completely ignore often much more significant working class involvement.
The reality of Gwangju uprising was very shocking. I was a middle-class kid who have little idea as to what is happening real world. I was insured and protected by my parents. But one thing that surprised me most about Gwangju uprising as a teenager when I read that book was that more workers worked than college students. It was very surprising because I thought college students was the bravest one who dared to take on military dictatorship then. But when things got very ugly, college students are the first one to run away. There was mass escape by college students during the uprising. Those who left behind was brave one, or they don't have no idea what's going on during the coup. It was a big shock to me.
This definitely has echoes of movements we spoke about in one of our earliest podcast episodes, at episode 4, where we talk about anti-fascist youth movements in Nazi-occupied Europe during World War II, where more middle-class historical movements like the Swing Kids or White Rose Group are much better known than the working-class Edelweiss Pirates and Schlurfs. Kim Yong Ho makes sure to tell his story to younger generations, to help bring Gwangju's real history to life.
이제 제가 지금 그런 이제 진실을 알리기 위해서 제가 일하는 곳에서
To deliver the truth at work, I invite about 500 teenagers from all over the country, middle school and high school, every year for a 2-day camp. 50 people at once, 10 times each. Though I can't do it now because of COVID-19. Usually I tell them about my experiences, but here's something I always tell them. May 18th is 40 years old now, and there's no violence like that at the moment, and there shouldn't be. Korean society now has improved incredibly in procedural democracy, but still, even though this is an old story from 40 years ago, if you read newspapers every morning, it is filled with stories of various discrimination and violence that still exist in our society. Such violence even happens at school. I emphasize, when we deal with discrimination and violence, we must try to step in and resist a little. That is what May 18th is about. That's the spirit of May 18th, I try to tell them. I say, you must always resist, and that you're not doing it alone, that you're doing it with your friends, and that you have to get everyone involved. In addition to this, I tell them politics is very important to institutionalize this. In the end, we should pay attention to politics because it is politics that decides all of Korean systems. And this is the story of mine at the camp. Especially now that it's been 40 years, I think that's why the spirit of May 18th is still important and needs to be talked about.
We asked Chun Yong Ho how he felt about the uprising 40 years later. He thinks that many of the benefits South Korean working class people today take for granted are the result of Gwangju and the struggles for democratization.
같은 건 60년
So seeing that now, the road to achieve this peace was only possible through the struggle, pain, and sacrifice. You know, the sacrifice and deaths, those are not for nothing. There was meaning behind them. That's what I believe.
Something which David Dolinger will never forget is the feeling of real human community which was forged on the streets in those 10 days of struggle.
The citizens of Gwangju came together. They unified about referendums. They took care of one another. People were worried about whether you were eating. I mean, it's, as I used to tell people, when I first lived in Korea, I had so many sisters, it was unbelievable. And the same thing was happening then. People were always trying to make sure that I was taken care of. But you could see they were also doing it for the other, in essence, the citizens that were out there on the front line. They were trying to take care of them and make sure that they were all right. That to me is something that you have to see. It's hard to even describe the unification that occurred, the rallies that occurred every day that were just gigantic. But one of the things that sticks most in my mind, and you could say that maybe it's dark, but it was the look in people's eyes.
Despite the restoration of democracy, today Chun Yong Ho believes that things still aren't perfect in South Korea.
이런 어떤 사회를 변화시키는 활동은 아마 인류가
Nowadays, the work and activism to change and improve today's society, well, that work always continues until the need to change and improve your society someday disappears. If not, the work should always continue. The struggle doesn't end.
And for Kap Su Seol, the spirit of Gwangju lives on around the world.
I think Gwangju still continue when people gather, press their demand. And the Gwangju is there in Myanmar now. I saw Gwangju during the Occupy Wall Street and during the Black Lives Matters. When there's people gather and press their demand, the government try to smash it. We sometimes fight each other over where we should go or over the direction of our movement. Or we fight against government or fight against police. But the same structure, same organic structure Gwangju had, we still have every movement. How to continue our fight, how to take care of each other, how to continue our tradition, how to defeat them. After defeat them, what kind of a world do we want to build after that? So Gwangju was kind of a very typical experience any human being experience, any human being should have over the course of their political life. Gwangju was in the past too, like the Gwangju was there in Spain, 1934-1936, during the Spanish Civil War. Gwangju was there in Paris in 1968. Gwangju was there in Washington, D.C. in 1968 during the anti-war movement. But the mechanism, the debate, the nature of the mechanism, nature of the debate, nature of organization that emerged out of the movement, Gwangju is not typical at all. Gwangju is repeat itself. But whether we win or not depends on how many people understand Gwangju, how many people understand the organizational debate, nature of a fight. Then more people prepare and ready for that debate and for that battle, people can win. But in the past 2 years was kind of very depressed period for me because the only thing I saw was defeat after defeat. But a little bit worried about what happened to the world. I mean, there was a clearly rise of a far right throughout the world. So that's why you should study history, and you should study Gwangju.
Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of our podcast mini-series on the 1980 Gwangju Uprising. We've got an additional bonus episode with some more tape from our interview with David Dolinger, which we were unable to fit into these main episodes. Our Patreon supporters can listen to this now. Our podcast is only made possible because of support from you, our listeners on Patreon. You can sign up and get access to exclusive benefits like this at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. If you can't support us right now, absolutely no worries, but please do take a second to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your favourite podcast app, and share links to our episodes on social media. If you want to learn more about the uprising, we very much recommend getting hold of the book which Kap Su Seol co-translated, Gwangju Diary. Link to buy it or read it online on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. We'd also recommend the historical fiction Human Acts by Han Kang. Finally, the 2017 film A Taxi Driver, starring Song Kang-ho of Parasite fame, is well worth a watch. It's got some elements fictionalized for dramatic effect, but the bulk of the film is generally historically accurate, and the recreation of crowd scenes is really impressive, and something that a lot of movie directors get really wrong. We've also got more info, photos, sources, transcripts, and more on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. I'd also like to take this opportunity to give a general apology for any mispronunciation on my part during these episodes. We would like to say a final thank you to all of our interviewees for speaking with us. Thanks also to Michael Choi for undertaking interviews in Gwangju, and Angela Lee, Jiminy Lee, and the Hun Coalition who helped with translation and dubbing. Thanks also to Rachel Min Park for helping us connect with people. Big thanks to our Patreon supporters, without whom we simply wouldn't have been able to make this. Special thanks to Connor Kanatsi, Shay, James, and Ariel Joya. Theme music for this episode was Marching for the Beloved, about the Gwangju Uprising, by Baek Ki-won, Hwang Suk-young, and Kim Jong-ryul. Link to stream it in the show notes. Big thanks to Jesse French, who has put in a huge amount of work over the last few months editing together this entire mini-series. And finally, thanks to all of you for listening. It really means a lot to us to be able to help tell these stories and have an audience for that. Thanks, and catch you next time.